looked into her eyes and basically said, I'm in the same position as you, I'm your friend, I have nothing against you, and instantly soothed her. And I thought, if I, or any leader or celebrity I know, is faced with a heckler, all we want to do is run away. And this was so startling to see somebody faced with a confrontational, angry voice and reaching out to them and diffusing it in that way. I also, this will be the last anecdote because I don't want to go on endlessly, but I remember the day, you probably know, many of you here are from Irvine, and the day that the Dalai Lama was awarded the Nobel Prize 20 years ago, he happened, as is his way, to be in Irvine at UCI, conducting a meeting with scientists. And the day after the Nobel was announced, I went to see him, intruding essentially on him during one of the busiest days in his schedule. And as soon as he saw me, although he shouldn't even really have been kind enough to open the door to me, he grabbed me by the hand and whisked me off to a little room. And as soon as we got into the little room, the first thing he was doing was trying to find a chair in which I would be comfortable, as if I were the Nobel laureate and he was the intrusive journalist. Then we sat down, and he looked across at me, and he said, well, straight from Beijing. So there we were. He looked across at me. Shanghai too. Right? We're still in the chair. He's still looking across at me. And he said, I just won this money. What should I do with it? And he was clearly waiting and looking for an answer. I was barely out of my 20s. I didn't know the difference between Tibet and Tahiti. But he was clearly going to ask everyone he met in the course of those early days and genuinely soliciting advice. And then, although this was clearly one of the most festive and promising moments for Tibet in its recent history, the first thing he said was, well, I really wonder if my efforts are enough. All I can do is try my hardest, but I don't know if anything, there's nothing guaranteed in life, and certainly victory is impermanent as loss. And in some ways that's a very prescient comment, because 20 years later, the Nobel hasn't transformed Tibet's predicament, as many people might have hoped. And then the last thing I remember is that at the end of our conversation, he grabbed me by the hand, as he does everyone, led me to the front door, and just as we were leaving, he said, oh, I forgot something. And he went into the room, and he turned out the light. And he said, well, it's just such a silly thing, it almost seems irrelevant. But if a few people remember to do this in various places across the globe, it can't do any harm, and it can actually help. And it certainly isn't taking anything out of me. And I realize, as I say that, it's been 20 years this October since that day, and in those 20 years, I've encountered so many wonderful works of philosophy and really wise men, and I've had so many inspirations of my own, as it seems to me, and all of those ideas have stayed in my head for about 5 days and then disappeared. And yet, that simple, everyday, lucid thing of turning off the light has actually remained with me. And now, for the last 20 years, probably almost every time I leave a room, I have turned off the light. And I think that's part of the very down-to-earth way in which he's trying to suggest we can turn things around in our lives and in our community. And I should stress at this point that when I talk about the Dalai Lama, I see him as only one in really a chorus of voices who is speaking for our planetary neighborhood and who are realizing that their constituency these days is all 7 continents. We've seen Bill Gates, for example, use such resourcefulness and determination to make a lot of money, and now he's using that same resourcefulness and determination to give it away to where it's most needed. We've seen Bishop Tutu have to deal with a very difficult issue of truth and reconciliation in his own country, South Africa, and then bring the wisdom he got from that to Northern Ireland and other divided countries that have to deal with those same issues of forgiveness and justice. We've seen our current president, as Professor Wegner was suggesting. I think whenever he sees the world, he doesn't think of America first. A part of him is thinking of Kenya, a part of him is thinking of Indonesia, a part of him is thinking of Hawaii. And one realizes that he's implicitly not seeing the world in terms of us versus them. He's seeing that what helps the far part of the world will only help us. Even we've seen the rock singer, Bono, of U2, tell us, I think very usefully, that the starving grandmother in Ethiopia is just as much our concern, and perhaps our problem, as the starving grandmother across the 405. Because in this world where geography is dissolved, or distance at least is diminished, her problem is our problem. That the kid suffering in Bangladesh is as much our responsibility as the kid in Compton or East LA. So I think the Dalai Lama really has just joined with a group of people to see that the call of the moment is to look beyond nations to a wider community, or as he puts it, family. And I'll just end by saying that when I was writing this book, it was a bit of a challenge because so much is known about the Dalai Lama. And I think when people in a room like this think of the Dalai Lama, we probably see the kind face smiling down at us from the Apple billboard, or the man who's on Larry King Live on CNN very often, or probably the guy who's on our deskmate's screensaver. I think the Dalai Lama appears as a screensaver on more computers than any other living being. And it's easy to forget that really 98% of his mission and his life is concerned with his own people, in Tibet and in exile, especially in India. And so I spent 3 of the last few springs just living in Dharamsala, India, across the street from him, going to talk to him, but also going to hear those increasingly restless young Tibetans around him who are releasing this entirely understandable human cry. How can we practice nonviolence and forbearance and friendship when our country is being razed to the ground, and our parents are being imprisoned, and our cousins are being killed? And I think the Dalai Lama clearly hears and understands that cry better than anyone, though his first priority is clearly to protect his Tibetan people. And so violence, he knows, is only going to bring more suffering to the Tibetans and to the Chinese. And the more time I spent in Dharamsala, the more I felt that in some ways this part of his life that most of us know the least about may be one of the greatest of his achievements, which is to take this people who had never lived lower than 15,000 feet, who didn't speak any English, who'd never had any contact with the outside world, and to create what even The Economist, not the most credulous of magazines, calls far and away the most successful refugee community in the world. And I learnt in my research that when he completed that flight that I'd listened to as a little boy, his first words as he set foot in India was to turn to his little brother and say, "Now we are free." Amazing thing. He's lost his country, he's lost the people he was born to rule, he's lost what seems to be his destiny. And instantly, he's not seeing it as loss, he's seeing it as possibility. He was saying, now we are free to do all the things we never could have done if we were stuck in old Tibet. Now we're free to create a new improved Tibet, like a Tibet 2.1. Now we can allow women to get doctoral degrees as they couldn't in old Tibet, and to become abbots as they couldn't. Now we can introduce modern science into the monks' curriculum. Now we can have children take all their lessons in Tibetan until they're 10 years old, so they're deeply connected to their culture, and all their lessons thereafter in English, so they're deeply connected to the rest of the world. And I think most important, now we are free to introduce democracy to our culture. And so his first year in exile, he wrote up a constitution for the first time in Tibetan history, with a clause that actually called for the impeachment of the Dalai Lama if such circumstances required it. And again, it speaks to that sense I was describing before of how, as the Stoic Epictetus said, every jug has 2 handles. Any situation has different ways you can approach it. And when we hear the word exile, we think of loss and severance from the past and sadness. When he sees exile, he sees future and opportunity and the chance actually to break free of what was outdated. And of course, as he is doing this and setting up his people with an exile home, his first priority is ensuring that they will have a solid and enduring lifetime after his. But I think he's also talking really to all of us, because this is, in some respects, the age of the exile. Certainly the age of the displaced person. By some counts, 200 million people now are living in countries very different from their original homelands. Many of you in this room, I know, fit that category. And so I think the Dalai Lama, in some ways, is speaking to us and the Palestinians and the Kurds and saying, even if you've lost your common soil, as long as you still have common grounds, common foundations, you haven't lost anything at all. Even if there's no Kurdistan on the map, as long as the best parts of Kurdish culture or religion or tradition are inside you, then Kurdistan is still alive and flourishing. And I think that excitingly opens out onto just the kind of global thinking that I've been doing in a very sort of amateurish way for many years. When Bipasha mentioned, I think, my kind of coining this phrase, the global soul, and that was because global is such a fashionable word these days, but it seems that nearly always we're talking about global technologies or global marketplace, the fact that we can send data across the world at the speed of light, and the fact that multinationals straddle the world. But I'm not sure if any of those are really going to sustain us in the long run. And it seemed to me that really what globalism needed was a soul.